That. Thank you all so much for joining us for this latest installment of Functions.nyc, which is the monthly speaker series from Tech NYC that does exactly that, talks about how NYC functions. So for those of you who are new to us, Tech NYC is the nonprofit representing the tech and startup community here in New York City across all 5 boroughs. We're a membership-based organization. We are now more than 800 member companies strong that include the largest tech employers like Facebook and Google, all the way down to very brand new startups and everything in between. And we are working with that network to, number one, ensure that the innovation economy here thrives. And number two, ensure that NYC remains the best place to build and grow a tech company. One of the ways that we feel it's really important to do that is to make sure that tech stays well connected to the larger fabric of the city, that tech brings its expertise and its resources to bear in supporting the city on a whole host of issues, the very issues that we are discussing and strategizing over in the Functions.nyc series. So far, that's looked like mass transit, public education, affordable housing, and today, we are really excited to be discussing policing and public safety as a part of that thread. So to have that conversation, we are so thrilled to be joined by Dr. Tracie Keessee. She is the co-founder and senior vice president of justice initiatives at the Center for Policing Equity. And by way of a little more intro, she returned to CPE most recently as deputy commissioner of the first ever Deputy Commissioner of Equity and Inclusion for the New York Police Department. And prior to that, served in a variety of other roles, including as Deputy Commissioner of Training at the NYPD. She's also a 25-year veteran of the Denver Police Department. Joining her is Michael Simon. He's the co-founder and CEO of Elucd, which is, number one, a Tech NYC member, and number two, a technology company that's worked with more than a dozen police departments, including the NYPD, to gather insights and collect data on community police sentiment. Prior to that, he established and ran the first of its kind in-house analytics shop for Barack Obama's presidential campaign. So we are thrilled to have all of you join us on the call, and thank you, Dr. Keessee and Michael, for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you two.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thanks, Hilary. Dr. Keessee, I am thrilled to be talking to you because, one, obviously policing is probably one of the 2 big themes of 2020 for the country, but for New York as well. And there's few people who have seen the inside of 2, really sort of iconic police departments as they've gone through incredible transition, and then have gone now to the outside to help policing evolve for the 21st century. I'm first, before I dive into talking about a little about NYPD, because I wanted to orient the folks in this call. I've learned so much about NYPD and how alike and how different it is from other police departments in the country. But I wanted to start just by digging a little bit into your background, because I think there's an interesting transition that you've made, and just wanted to hear a little about that transition from being a police executive and rising star in the world of policing to now going to CPE.
Sure, and thank you again for the invitation. So the journey with CPE started 12 years ago, so I have to sort of lift that up. So it's not new to me
Okay.
as one of the co-founders. But I would go back and say that sort of the uniqueness of the background really has to do with being grounded in community and really wanting to understand what the public safety needs are of a community. Specifically for me, it's the Black community. And as a person of color in uniform, one of the things I was challenged with often was, what are we doing, right? What's happening here, and how are we serving this community? Are we doing this in a way in which it does not harm a community even more, but really meets the needs? So, that work, CPE was co-founded about 12 years ago. I was still with Denver PD at the time, and beginning to really ask those sort of research questions. And this is before my postdoc work, about how do we, do certain things, and how do we get community engagement and understand engagements on, multiple levels. So that journey just took me, not just sort of this parallel journey. So it was work and school at the same time. I'm sure there's many folks who remember that. while you're putting yourself through school and working at the same time. It just so happened, again, this was the space that I was going to be really occupying and needed to have a really good understanding. My journey to New York was different. It was not really anticipated. And I can tell you that in all transparency, when I was younger, I wanted to move to New York, but my parents said no. And so I had to wait until I was old enough to do it on my own to say, okay, I'm leaving now. I'm going to New York. But I arrived in New York as the director of the Obama Initiative, the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice at John Jay, and doing that work with, at the time, 6 different police departments, and really doing innovative work to try to move that needle. How do we do this? How do we reconcile? How do we have conversations about race? How do we make sure that the engagement isn't disparate? So a lot of that work was really grounded there. It would be from that position that I would get the call to come to NYPD to be the Deputy Commissioner of Training. And I would, lift up again to say that I, being in policing for 30 something odd years, sort of viewed NYPD as this self-contained kind of animal apparatus thing, right? That they can, doesn't matter what happens, they can survive everything. They've got everything that they need. And so yet I was very surprised that they were willing to go outside of, I would say, NYPD, knowing the talent level that was there, but really understanding, and this was, Bratton came back at the time, and so it was under Bratton, really understanding that they were just needing a third eye, as we always say, right? Somebody just to come in and take a look and see if we can do some different things there that will produce different results. Staying there, of course, for a couple of years, and then in that work produced the need for the equity and inclusion piece. Some of that was internal and some of it was external. And so then under Jimmy O'Neill, really standing up that particular shop and really trying to get a good understanding of a life cycle of a recruit to officer to retirement, what happens in that space, and how does how you look, how you show up, impact that work and the environment. So it was a very incredible learning experience, but also being able to come into that space and relate as a police officer, someone who worked the street and moved through the ranks, and did similar things, to be able to sort of make those connections with folks and say, okay, let's do it and see what we can figure out. And you mentioned, Michael, too, that the culture is different. Everybody's culture is different. And I don't think most people get that cultures are very different from department, but there are those similar things we do share. That's why you feel such that reverberation of the homicide of Mr. Floyd. The reason why that swept through so quickly is because there are things that we share, and we share that uniform, and we share that gun belt. And so those are the things that will always sort of tie us all together. A number of things will, but that was probably the most prominent.
You talked about the life cycle of sort of a recruit coming into a department and then rising up. And obviously there's different departments, different sizes, different stratification of leadership, NYPD probably being the most elaborate because it's,
that's right,
several times larger than the next largest department.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I was actually sort of surprised by coming in, I'm new to the world of policing. I've been working on this for 5 years. The emphasis put on recruiting and on human capital and policing is something that has been sort of a behind the scenes issue, for demand for policing, what the public wants from policing. And I'm curious on your take on how that sort of human capital issue connects in with how people are now re-envisioning what policing should look like in the next era.
So you broke up on the first part, so I'm going to have you repeat that one more time because you blanked out there for a little bit. So,
sorry about that.
So sorry, that's okay.
AirPods. No, I was saying that the there's been a sort of a change or a recognition that there is a change in demand for what people want from policing.
Mm-hmm.
And for a long time, I think it's been understood that a police force that looks like the community they serve has been sort of one of, if not the most important things. I think that it feels like the tectonic plates have shifted, and there's been a sharp sort of change in demand from what people want from the police departments. And wonder if you could talk a little about the evolution of that over this last year, what we've been seeing.
I think it's interesting how you tied, the diversity of that particular piece together. But what we've been seeing, there has been quite the shift, right, in regards to what community is asking. And actually, we serve at the pleasure of community, and community does get to dictate what we do. You have folks that will, I'm sure counter that. But part of that too is what we're watching play out is what is the role? What is it you would like a public safety department or policing department to do? We know that there's been lots of conversations on the ground with community in regards to reducing that footprint in communities that are typically have been underserved, right? And so if we do a lot of work around data, and if we look at that, we can look at different boroughs and different neighborhoods and know there's been lack of investment. Jobs are sparse there. You can look at the education data. You can look at the health data now, even with the pandemic, and see the really stark disparities. And so what you're hearing really from the street are a couple of things. One, it's asking for, pretty much all of throughout the country to decouple criminalizing social behaviors that have not been addressed. And so in order to do that, that means that you're going to have to figure out, again, what is the role of public safety and what does that look like? And a lot of times what you'll see and what we're hearing is we're not quite sure what to do with this group, but we do know we need mental health help. We need jobs. We need, all those things. We look at the schools and see how the schools are really configured in those underserved communities. We need investment here, where investment historically has not been consistent or sometimes non-existent. And so in that process that's going on, and it'll be going on for quite some time, while this process is happening, you also have to ask yourself, if we are saying we want this group of people to behave different or even to respond differently, that particular job duty, job function is going to have to be outlined and described, because it is going to impact who you start to bring on and what types of behaviors you're looking for and what types of interactions you want them to do. And so, all of those things will matter when we get to what that it is. One of the things historically that has always been part of the narrative is if, the community reflects, the department, then some of these things should not be happening. And we know that that's not necessarily the case. And so what you really want to be able to sort of go into is diversity is nice, yes, and diversity is wonderful because it does bring those different lived, experiences and perspectives. But you also need to have folks knowing what are they doing. When you come here, if you want to go here, what are you doing? And what is it you want me to do? And where are the areas I'm not supposed to be? And then if I'm not there, who is picking that up? Because part of the national conversations you're hearing, and even in New York, is if it's not the police department, then who? And if it's another group of people, you have to begin to scale up so you can have those services transferred over. But this whole kind of wanting to cut people off, I understand the sentiment behind, I get it, I understand it. But what we also have to sort of be sort of mindful and remind ourselves of, people are getting victimized daily in the hour. And so someone's going to have to respond to those needs. So, and to answer your question, understand what the role should be moving forward is going to impact the types of folks who come into that business and even stay, because that's the other part of it as well. So it's not just who wants to do this work, who's going to stay and who's going to retire and who's going to, move on.
This has obviously been the sort of what's come to be known as the defund the police movement. In some ways, terminology has become really politically loaded. Mm-hmm. And I, talking to a lot of police executives, which I do for my day job, I'm sure you do as well, I've sort of seen people of two minds. I've seen people become defensive, when defund the police is wielded as a punishment for bad behavior, or it's perceived as being wielded as punishment for bad behavior. And I've also seen a lot of police chiefs say, at least behind closed doors, we don't want to be in the space of being the frontline responders to mental health crises or to homelessness or some of these issues. I'm curious what you're seeing as you talk to police executives around the country?
No, it's pretty similar. I mean, first of all, there's really no shared language, right? So whether you talk about abolitionism, whether you talk about defund, where you got divest, we all know what's behind that. At least, I do. I get it. I understand what's behind it. I think most people do. It may not feel good being on the receiving end of it, but if you sort of not personalize what's happening here, it's hard for folks not to do that. But if you just step back and say, okay, there's reasons why people ask and do what they do. Lived experience, beliefs. It's not for anyone to say that's a right or wrong thing, but to understand what's happening. So not having sort of that shared language, because you're absolutely right. What you hear chiefs say is we don't want to go there. We certainly don't want to be enforcing social distancing rules, right? If we already have issues with community, why on earth would you send us in there to do something that way, right? And oftentimes those things get politicized. And so what you really have to ask yourself is, if it's not them, then who? And this is a governance leadership issue. Because if the default is this group, then that means that we've got something else going on here, right? So if it's not them, then who? And once you figure out again who the who is, this is also going to reduce that footprint in the community, because you don't have a uniformed person that's showing up in a space that needs something else. And you'll hear not just chiefs, but you'll hear patrol officers going to calls, and this was my own experience, going to calls, getting there and saying to myself, I'm not the person she needs right now, or they need right now. And yet the only tools I have are these, right? So I have very limited tools. I can either, take this person to jail, give them a ticket, try to explain something, maybe refer them to another agency, and then just leave, hoping that nothing else comes of it. But you have that. And so, I think because of the way we are nationally, it's emotional, it's hard, it's politicized, it's reactionary for a lot of folks. I understand all of that. But we are saying the same thing. If police are saying, hey, no, we don't want to do that, then it makes sense to look at your efficiencies to see how many people do you have doing this, right? And that savings in that, funding, budgeting, earmarked is what the community is talking about. It's like, so if you're spending that much money, you can invest that money over here, so you don't have to do that. And so that's really the way in which we have that conversation. That doesn't exclude, though, there are some people who just say, we don't want police. I get that. And then, in that conversation becomes one of, if not police, then what? We've heard anything from community models, which is absolutely fine. Those have to be able to sustain themselves. But what we're not hearing is, what about the violence? And we know what causes the underlying sort of fundamental pieces of the violence and how those things sort of emerge with one another. But while we are trying to get to this end, you cannot ignore what's happening on a daily basis. And those things have to be addressed. And when you do that, you really have to think about how you reduce the harm while you're trying to get there, because people still need services. And I think what you're hearing, and you hear this from seniors and you hear this from folks on the ground, tell us what you want us to do. What is it you want us to do? And I would say most would say right now, we don't want to do it. But then we also have to be able to, account for when you have events where you don't want police and those turn violent. Who's going to respond? And these are the sort of the questions that we're asking, not in a sense of being, sort of flippant and smart alecky, but to help broaden that conversation around, okay, understand the end, but we have to figure out how do we begin to ramp that stuff down and build up what we need. And it's not literally turn it off one day, turn it on the next, because the system's just not designed that way.
What do you see? I mean, one of the things that's always impressed me about CPE, and I'm not saying this just to puff up your ego, but there's a lot of people in the world of policing who have strong opinions. I think one of the things that CPE does particularly well is they bring a point of view, but they bring data to the conversation and they bring evidence to the conversation. What is CPE's perspective, and what do you see? What are the recommendations as you're advising police departments? Like, how do I listen right now? What should we be doing? I know this is a really tough time. A lot of people are just sort of hands up in the air, worrying, wondering what's next.
Yeah, and a lot of it is listening. It's starting with that, right? We have enough data. We have enough data and systems. We've done enough historical research and work to know what the solves are. And so really it's starting to listen and really understand that alternate perspective other than your own. Because what we're not just talking about, disparities, we're talking about the issue of race as it runs in those inequities through all those systems. And so part of our conversation is not just about the data, because data will help point you to where you need to go and to think and to do, deep dives and lift up the hood types of situations. But it's also, there's two things happening. One, we have a lot of chiefs that were like, I don't know what to do. I don't even know where to begin. We thought we had community relationships. Apparently we did not, or we defined relationships differently. And so one of the things that CPE created was sort of a roadmap, and we call it's just a roadmap. It's basically starting with data, starting with a demand, starting with the 911 calls, 211, 411, see where the demand is coming in and what types of calls are coming in, and taking that data and laying it over your neighborhoods and your boroughs and see, and we all know this because we used to do this with CompStat, right? Those glowing spots where those issues are overlapping with one another. Those are the places you start with first. And those are what we call public safety zones. That's where the investment goes. That's where the money goes. That's where people are in there saying, okay, let's build out the community need. Let's make sure we press down as many services as possible in those spaces. And then let's collect data to make sure that those services are behaving in the way in which we want them to behave. Much like you, we're about data. It's like, it's not the answer to all, but it certainly does give you a rich perspective to say, let's look at X and let's look at Y. And so for us, as we have these conversations, not just with chiefs, community members, activists, all kinds of folks, it is really sitting down and saying, okay, listening, which is a skill that is extremely hard if you really think about it. It's like, let's listen to what is being asked, or ask, demand, however people want to put that, and then really have to sort of do this internal work and say, if they're asking us to move out of a certain space, what are the mechanisms to make that happen? And if we do that, what does happen? So what are the unintended consequences? Who else are we connected to? What other services rely on that particular interaction? So there really is this sort of unpacking of certain processes and things that we've done. And that's sort of on a policy level, but you also have to understand some of that's policy, some of it's law. That you can, sometimes you have the authority to say whether or not we're going to really press this particular portion of the law or not. Some would argue you don't have that option. So when it's the law, it's the law. And so what we also find is, I would say chiefs sometimes are not knowing where to go. We also find community who doesn't often understand governance. And that's the other piece. And that is way of, how does the budget work? How is it, the first question, what is that structure that we're talking about, and how does that structure operate? And those are important things to know when you're trying to do reimagining work or whatever it is. But it's also a very, deep balance when you're trying to have folks come together who don't want to be together right now. That's the other part, right? So we have these sort of unique pieces to this, but for us, it's really giving chiefs and communities sort of tools to start that work. What you also have to do in this work is you have to manage expectations, because what I also find is that, I'll use an example, Executive Order 203 in the state of New York is a really thoughtful framing process, right? On what are the key sort of themes that we need to look at. And it's really designed to get folks to start talking that way. Right. But I think what sometimes becomes difficult is when you put deadlines on things, right? Because as if once we meet the deadline, problem solved. That's not it. It is, once we get started, we can't stop. We have to make sure that we make sure we address those things that we say we are, do them, fund them, put them out for comment, bring them back in, bring community in to help focus on those things. So for CPE, it is really all about that work. And under our umbrella, we have everybody. We have former, chiefs, we have activists, we have, data nerds like in your house, and we have scientists, and we have folks that really are mirroring what's happening, on the broader side. And so it's really one of really being thoughtful and pushing past the way we would like to do. And government struggles with control. This is probably one of the most interesting exercises you're going to see, and that is community reactivating its power and the way government's reacting to that. Because they're asking for things, and government's just like, I don't know, and they're pushing and they're pushing. So it's really going to be probably 2 or 3 years out before we get a good sense of how much change, but we do know the reactivation of power in the community is creating, I wouldn't say new, but I would say a reality check for government about what this is and what this isn't. And so it's going to be, for social scientists, it's going to be really interesting to see as we look back 5 or 10 years from now, to see how much of that shift is shifted and sustained, and for the betterment of community too. So it's going to be very interesting.
So this series is called Functions at NYC. So I want to ask you a couple of questions from the perspective of a New Yorker. What should every New Yorker know about the NYPD, how it's organized, how centralized and decentralized is the power, who runs our local, who's the kind of person who runs our local precinct, what are they doing every day? Just give us a little bit of kind of NYPD 101 here.
Yeah, well, some of those things may have changed under Commissioner Shea, so
Sure.
I can only speak to my time and experience. But the structure of NYPD, as you've already mentioned, it's rather large, and it's large because the city is large. So it makes sense, and you have to have what you need there. But of course, you have the commissioner at the top who is setting policy and direction. Deputy commissioners.
The commissioner is appointed by the mayor, right?
He's appointed by the mayor, and then you have deputy commissioners, which can be either internal or external. They are hired. Mm-hmm. They can be appointed, and they are over very large sections of the organization. So, for example, training, investigations. Chief of patrol has got all the uniformed personnel. You've got housing, you've got transit. So it's very large, and it is a structure in which it mirrors that of other police departments. It's just bigger. I mean, it's supersized, as I always say. It's just bigger. In the precincts or in the actual areas where you can go into your neighborhood, and I was in the 3-4. There's a commander there, and there's a certain number of officers that are housed there. They get dispatched to 911 calls, and at the time they were NPOs doing neighborhood policing, and they were out on foot and assigned to certain areas, and their role is to get to know the neighborhood. And it's not just those folks, it's everybody. It's everybody who's got a permanent car assignment, who works particular sectors, but it is one in which you have a certain geographic area that you have someone that's managing it, making sure that things are going well. It's lots of communication across boroughs, across precincts. So that work happens in very different ways. But one of the things that we always have talked about, and this is not just an NYPD thing, it is to get to know who your local CO is in those precincts. They usually are the ones that are closest to what's happening in the community. They have a good beat on that, and this is where a lot of the innovation happens. And it's a lot of where the innovation doesn't get pushed necessarily up to the top, is that they, working very closely with community and trying to think of different things, that work for this particular area. Not everything is going to work, in Washington Heights might not work, somewhere else in the Bronx might not look that way, but they are really closest to the work. The officers there as well. And so what you will see on a daily basis is typically cars going to calls, or doing discretionary stops, as we say. So if officers see something or want to do an investigation, they can do that. There's lots of rules and laws that are guiding their, post-stop question and frisk, what they should be doing. And so it's one of those things where we say, if you want to really understand, then you really need to understand, what you're working with. And, most, I would say, places, and I believe they're still doing this, probably because of COVID, not citizens police academies. How do you get in and understand what's going on? So there's spaces there. Plus, go to the website, you can read, you can hear. If you have contact with folks, I find that it's not that hard to turn around to somebody who does not know an NYPD officer or someone in that connection that you start having those conversations with. But I would say that, functionality, it has some of the main functions of most police departments. It's just larger. And, the work that happens closer to the ground. And that's why those CEOs become equally as important, as you would say a chief, because they're there. They're every day. They know what's going on. And so I can tell you, with the CEO that I had at 3-4 at the time, not because I worked there. I mean, they had no idea who I was, but it was one of the things of, clearly, it was, for me, I was not into saying, I'm the commissioner, all hell, I guess, whatever you do, but really trying to get to know, what's going on, what's happening in the neighborhood. And really just in a stop-in, You would hope that the engagement would be this way everywhere, but just pleasant folks at the front. You know, if the CO was not in, there was a lieutenant or someone there who could say, okay, you know, questions that you have. So really, it's that engagement, but it's also part of where we are in this moment today, and that is, what do you want the role of all of those folks to be? What do you want them to really do? And then one of the things that you want to do is make sure that when we talk about uniformed personnel, the number of non-sworn personnel that it takes to support that work is equally as important. And I have to lift that up every time. So when we usually hear them referred to as civilians, majority of those civilians are women. And so it's really understanding, you know, how.
And what does that mean? What are those? I just want to bring some color to folks who aren't familiar with this world. What are they doing?
Well, I mean, they're doing everything from 911 operations, from school resource officers, from whether they work in, you know, records, or, you know, they're supporting staff in the investigations of the academy. I mean, anywhere you can think of where you need someone to help with administrative functions, there are people there. And I would say, and this is what I always say, if they walked out, we would stop functioning. That's what I'm meaning by administratively they're there. And so it is one in which you are thinking of it, you know, how do you do that? And so, I'm sorry, I was just looking at the question. CO does equal commanding officers. So thank you. And yes, they're in charge of the precinct. So it is one of those things where if you think about it, you do have this sort of, you know, other thing happening in the community where you've got folks who are there for safety and to protect. You just want to make sure that you are doing what community is asking you to do. And right now, that's the most difficult thing. And we're trying to figure out, what does that mean? What does that look like? And how you get those voices and how you get those things in are going to be critical. And I'm just checking the chat. And yes, there are admin in each of the precincts. So thank you for asking that question.
How would you suggest that, you know, for your average New Yorker, and there's 76 precincts, 76 commanding officers. They're actually they're small. They're neighborhood. You know, they're sort of deployed in neighborhoods, but those neighborhoods might be a few 100,000 people, depending on the size of the precinct. What's the best way for your average for the New Yorkers who are on this Zoom right now to make sure that they do have an opportunity to be heard? What are the ways in which NYPD's, you know, or other departments who are receiving that?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, it may be different, you know, under Commissioner Shea, but I think that one of the things that you can do when COVID, and they may not be doing it this way, but, you know, whenever there's time for community engagement, right? So whenever the ask is to come and to help and to hear and to provide your input, to do that when you can. To often, you know, if it's possible, to stop in and just, you know, before you stop in, I would say call, because usually the CO is out on the street as well. But to, you know, call the precinct and say, hey, I want to, you know, stop in and see the CO for a minute if I can, if it's possible. Tell them who you are, where you live, what your interest is. A lot of the local sort of neighborhood precincts have advisory councils where they will bring in members of the community to help them think through certain strategies. So there's a number of ways to do that. And I mean, so, you know, that's part of it. I'm sure if they're like anybody else, you know, they have Facebook, they have Twitter. So there's other ways in which you can get that information, or other ways you can get your questions, you know, sent to them as well. And they have what we call, not necessarily traditional, but the comm shop, where you have public information officers where you can go get information in regards to what you need. And so I think that there's many ways to engage. And I think what people are often sort of stopping is because you're trying to figure out what is it you really want to know? What are you trying to find out? What are you trying to understand? And so you really want to make sure that you are, to the best of your ability, trying to, you know, put that in a frame. So, you know, what is it I want to know? And, you know, if there's something happening in the neighborhood, usually that's the number one thing is, you know, I had, you know, a helicopter was over the apartment, you know, 181st in Amsterdam. What was going on? You know, and usually you can go to, you know, to Twitter or Facebook and they'll say, we're doing something in this particular. So it's really trying to engage and to go into that way. But I would say most departments will have places in which you can engage. And I would, again, make the assumption that with Executive Order 203, that there's reaching out now, right? So trying to get that information and trying to to have it, and how you reach out and who you reach out to becomes even more critical, and how you get those voices who traditionally would not engage. Because a lot of times folks, will engage if they're comfortable, but you do have, just so many folks who just are not comfortable in that space for their reasons and won't come into that space. And you really have to think about how do you engage and how do you get those voices to the table as well.
Speaking of bringing voice to the table, I know we're about at the point where we're going to open this up to questions from the participants, but I just want to ask you, Executive Order 203, can you give us a little bit of background on what that is? Because I know I want to make sure everyone's clear on what that is.
Sure. And so the best of my ability. So the governor issued Executive Order 203, which really is directing police departments to look at themes of what we would call, some would put under the reform umbrella, themes of reform and reimagining, such as, do you do procedural justice or implicit bias training? What does the staffing model look like? How do you recruit and retain? How are you holding your officers accountable? How does the community access what they need? So transparency pieces. So there's themes there that are outlined in which the process is for police departments to engage with those that they serve and begin to figure out what's the model that's appropriate for that particular community in that neighborhood, and bringing in those voices and those serving, on the ground. So those that are NGOs and folks that do, violence disruption and things like that, making sure all voices are brought into this process, in the end, to produce what they would consider to be a collaborative proposal on moving policing forward. All of those are due April 1st. I know that because we're partnering on one, but it's really the process that's going to be key here. It's not just getting to the April 1st deadline. It's hopefully setting up something that goes beyond April 1st. And that means, data democratization. How do you push data out as opposed to having people search for it? All of those things are sort of in that little booklet, which, I was very surprised, but I can tell you that the state of New York that I can find is the only one that has done it this way. And that has provided guidance. Now, whether or not folks on the ground want to take that, it does provide a structure, does provide, sort of things for chiefs to do and starting to do to get to where they need. So that's a little bit about 203. I might have left some things out there, but I was very, very impressed by the fact that the state had sort of set this up. And I think that what's going to be interesting is just the sheer number of police departments within New York. You're going to get some very different proposals. And I think that the interest will be, once those come up, who's going to determine which ones get funded or not.
I shared a link for those who are interested in the chat to the Executive Order 203, so you can read up on it on your own. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tyler, how are we going to do Q&A here?
Yeah, I'd love for this to just be an open conversation where folks can jump in, unmute themselves, ask questions, have a little bit of a back and forth. Maybe I'll just kick things off. And of course, if folks don't want to turn their video or sound on and want to continue to use the chat feature, please do that as well. But maybe I'll just kick things off with a question I know that we at TechNYC care a lot about, which is that, a lot of the folks on the Zoom are founders and engineers at companies that are building products and services that they hope can be useful to police departments or useful in a sort of public safety or in a law enforcement or in an emergency response space. And I'd be curious to hear, from Dr. Keessee and also from Michael too, I'd love to hear you weigh in this one as well. What sort of tools are useful to police departments? When you hear from police chiefs or even with your own sort of research work at CPE, what sort of tech tools have you found to be useful thus far? And Michael, you are building those tools and you're actually partnering with police departments to make those tools useful inside those agencies. What's the process like being a private company partnering with a public agency, especially in a place where I imagine that procurement process is quite complex? Would love to just, get a sense of what those partnerships feel like.
I'll go first. I would say, when we talk about the tools and what's needed, I would say the first thing we would need is We have so many disparate records management systems, and we have a lot of sort of companies that own those, and they're not the best for doing research or collecting data in a way that can be analyzed. And so really making sure that as we think about future iterations of systems that collect data from the work that police are doing, that they're designed in a way in which they can answer the community's questions, because right now that's not the case. And we find out there's lots of missing data because it's not being asked, because it's not necessarily needed to be reported, whether to the state or to the federal government. And so that would be the other piece. The other thing that I think that is equally as important, and what I really enjoyed watching NYPD do, and that is that simple cell phone that has all the apps on it that you need to get the information that you need. When I came on, you used to have to go back to dispatch for everything. And that was whether you were clearing somebody, or if you needed somebody to bring you something, or you had to take doing a show up somewhere. That app, that phone, the ability to have those things at your fingertip, whether it is, not just doing photographs, but it's interpretation for multiple languages. I mean, it's all of those things. What traditionally you would have had to wait for somebody, or you would have to call and dial up and have somebody you talk and then they talk, and then you got this whole third party thing going on, which is not bad, but it's not ideal. So it's really helping officers do that work in a really more efficient way. Generationally, I mean, we think it's going to go beyond that, of course, right? And so I was the group where you had tablets and you actually could do a report with tablets, and the folks that came on before me were just losing their mind, like, oh my God, what's happening? You're not going to be able to ever get that information back. So, but you see this ease of technology as the generations begin to shift, and it's not just about the engagement, it's about keeping people safe, right? Where you don't need to be in spaces you shouldn't be in spaces. And so this sort of lends itself to whether it's online reporting, or if you're able to take a picture of an accident and send it in, and that populates an accident report for you. So, I mean, it's all of those ways and more that allow for, I think, not just for efficiencies for police departments, but also efficiencies for the community, because you can't always stop what you're doing and get what you need. This is barring a immediate 911 emergency. And it's also technology has been used in the way with which we engage with community now, because of social media, with Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. I mean, all of those things. And then, I'll let Michael talk about survey work. I mean, all of the stuff that we do. So we watch this evolution from having mobile data terminals in the car, just pulling up simple information from a centralized record system, to these very, very much integrated systems where you can download body-worn camera footage, where you can overlay that with the 911 calls. I mean, so it just gets more and more, I think, better, and it just allows for that more efficiency. And I think the efficiencies are what the community is talking about, right? And it's not that I'm certainly trying to put people out of a job. I collect a pension for policing, so I'm not advocating for that. But there is this notion, while you have COVID happening, and we know the budgets are going to be decimated, just from this whole pandemic piece, that you have to really start thinking about those efficiencies. Are there ways we can do this better, and sort of guarantee the validity of what we're doing? And then, that way allows you to use your human capital in a much more strategic way. So we see it growing. I can tell you the evolution from the brick radio to the small radio to the cell phone, just in my lifetime, has just been leaps. And so I'm sure there'll be more than that.
A little bit of perspective, sort of from the perspective of an entrepreneur in this space, both the tough part and the great part. I'll start with the tough part. It's very, very hard in general for government to innovate on the technology front. And that's largely because, one, move fast and break things doesn't really work when people's lives depend on it. You have to be careful and considerate and thoughtful, and not let, if a 911 call for domestic violence incident slips through the cracks because of technology, that's a big problem. So it's got to really be incredibly robust before it can be deployed. And second, procurement is really broken. And I think, as someone who is in the business of selling things to government, I can tell you, when you've got someone on one side who desperately wants something, and you've got from another side who wants to sell it to them, but they can't buy it, that's a problem. And there's a lot of reasons why procurement rules exist. And I think there's a lot of great reasons because, the last thing we want to do is have waste, fraud, and abuse of taxpayer dollars. But the system that advantages companies that have been around a really long time leads to a lot of the problems that Dr. Keessee talked about with things like interoperability of data formats. There's all these legacy companies out there that they don't have the best solution. So the way they protect the moat around their product is they make it such that the data can't be taken outside of the product or it can't work with another product. So there's a lot of the system as a result is incredibly antiquated, and it's very frustrating. I know both for the buyers of technology and also those of us who create technology in the space. I would say, however, the plus side is because the public sector and policing especially is so starved for innovation, it's so hard. When there is innovation, when there are great products, they spread like wildfire, mostly by word of mouth. And I think about my own experience here. We now work with a number of the largest police departments in the country. That has all happened by word of mouth. We've never really spent $1 in marketing, and it's because when you create a product that people like, unlike if Coca-Cola and Pepsi have products they like, they will try to actively hide their use of that product from the other. In the world of policing, when something works, and I know Dr. Keessee could talk about this because they're creating at CPE things like this roadmap and other things that are designed for use by a lot of departments and to spread really quickly. When people see something they like, they will become advocates and they will become evangelists for something new. And so that has been something that I've never experienced in my career before. The willingness of someone to say, I love this thing. It's solving a big problem for me that's never been solved before. Let me go, shout from the rooftops about how great it is. And so that has sort of, as frustrating as the slowness and the procurement stuff has been, the enthusiasm among early adopters has really been great. Hey, Dora.
Hey.
Chime in.
Hi, can I just pick up here? Certainly the point about the need for efficiency so that police departments can function more effectively makes a lot of sense. I would want to put out a pitch, picking up of some sort of a big thing that Dr. Keessee had said in terms of this shift between what we as citizens want our police organizations to do, and how that's changing. And I'm glad to hear that it's changing in some constructive way. It's sort of what's brought me to this table. And I very recently, after living in the same neighborhood in New York for over 25 years, went to visit my precinct for the first time. And that's why I was asking to make sure I was getting the terminology right. And just some stuff happened. And anyway, I don't need to explain, but I went to my first community meetings and my first Build a Block meeting. And I was surprised by a lot of what I learned. And so from a technology standpoint, I think I want to make a pitch for, yes, efficiency so the officers and the admin staff can work better. At the same time, if we really are having a shift in what citizens expect from our policing organizations, then what can we do to engage those citizens in a constructive way? So just, large sample size of 3 meetings that I've attended in the past 2 months. Some stuff that kept coming up was, sure, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, but it was really about Nextdoor, the app Nextdoor, which spread word of mouth through the shutdown. Citizen, more as a bad thing versus a good thing, but a thing that we have, Citizen app. And then in New York City specifically, just the increased number of helicopters just constantly droning overhead. But it just seemed that like if there could be some motivation for some magical love child of Nextdoor, Citizen, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and all the back end stuff that police departments are getting, then I think it would help engage the citizenry in a more constructive way of saying, hey, what is it that we really want and what don't we want? And I don't know if anyone's working on that or how.
I appreciate you lifting that up, because that is the challenge of when you're talking about doing reinvention work, right? So how do you get those voices in? And we also keep in mind, so yes, on what you're saying, +1 on all of that, right? How do you get that out and make sure that it comes in a way? But the other sort of area that is yet to really be, I think, sort of reviewed and tried on something different of those that are in the vulnerable population, those that are coming back through reentry, those that are homeless. Those usually take what we call that one-on-one contact, where we're going to have to really just go and spend time and work this particular area and ask those questions if you can. That's sort of, so it's this creation of this hyper safe space where people can come in it and not worry about, because you have people concerned about technology who are, not worried about what's happening, but can drop or leave something, right? Where it does get to the police department and say, if you're asking me this question, this is what I think. And so we still find the challenge. Those who use technology will always use it. My mother's 80 and she's on Facebook, and I still shake my head. I'm like, I don't get it. You wouldn't get a cell phone, but you're so on fire here, on this particular platform. But what we're trying to still have conversations around it is the most vulnerable, who are non-trusting of government, and how do you get that? And I think the other conversation around that too, Dora, is technology can't replace everything. We may have to just say that for these segments, it's got to be somebody going in and doing it. But I'm with you. I think if we could get something, and I've also noticed, not just through the pandemic, but as we moved, some of those apps, like Nextdoor, have a problem, and communities of color will not use them. And so you're missing a whole segment of folks who are just like not engaging on that platform. So I'm with you. I don't know what that looks like, but yes, there has to be a way where all voices can come in, and we don't have to worry about who is, saying that's not the case. All voices come in, but I'm also really concerned about those who would never, engage in that particular piece. That's sort of the space right now we're all trying to figure out. And the only solution we could think of right now is folks are gonna have to mask up and actually just go door to door on some things and see if we can get some other information another way. So
yeah, well, I'm with you on the need to mask up and walk around. I mean, I was excited to learn that we have neighborhood police officers, just 2 people that are assigned to my little 10-block little radius of my little corner of New York City here. But they drive. They don't walk. And I live in a low rise now. A neighborhood that's changed a lot in the past 25 years. But it's kind of like, dudes, if you're not walking, how do you know anything? And so that's just such a low tech kind of suggestion. But
yes, it is very low tech, right? Walking and tour. It's actually what we would call old school tour. It's just old school. That's just the way you would do it. Absolutely.
I would just add one more layer, which is, from my conversations with police chiefs around the country, this is tremendously frustrating to them too. They know that, if I hold a community meeting, it's basically going to be the same 20 people who always show up. Maybe there's a little bit, maybe 10% drop out, 10% new, but it's basically the same sort of. So what happens is the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And I know, as the person in charge of running this department or running this precinct, I can only really rely so much on what I'm hearing. And so I think it's a frustrating logjam where, your police leader, your well-intentioned police leader at least wants to listen to what the community has to say. But on the community side, you're sitting there thinking, I'm not sure I want to go to I'm not sure either I want to, or I'm not sure that I have the time to go to a, 7 to 8 p.m. community meeting when I've got, at least one job, a kid to put to bed, et cetera, et cetera. So it is a real conundrum. It's one, sort of why I started this company, Elucd, but it's a real conundrum. It's something that needs solving and has become even more acute.
Yeah, great. I know we're right at the top of the hour, so I want to be mindful of folks' time. Just want to say quickly thank you to Dr. Keessee and Michael for chatting with us all this afternoon. Everyone who's on the call was also added to the calendar invitation, which means that you have my email address. So if I and or Tech NYC can continue to facilitate introductions or do any follow-up that you think would be interesting for you, please do not hesitate to reach out. Make sure Tech NYC can be useful for all the work that you're continuing to do. And with that, I will say thank you once more and have a great rest of the day, everyone.
Thank you. You too, everyone. Thanks
Thanks
Michael.
a lot. It was great.
Take care.
Thank you, Dora.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Bye, everyone.